Okay, welcome everybody to the first breakout session, PSR. And hold on just a second, I'm gonna try to find our Dave. Can you hear us? How do I? Hold on a second. Hold on a second. We got just a little to attendee. David Clark. There he is. Okay, Dave Clark, can you hear us?
You can hear.
Okay, there we go.
Okay. So Tyler has already shared his screen. So Dave, I'll turn this right away over to you, and you can start the session.
Okay, great. Thank you, Posse. My name's Dave Clark. I'm with the University of Tennessee, and I'm the session moderator for this session, which is on precision scheduled railroading, Class 1 and Shortline connection. And we have three speakers, which I'm looking forward to hearing. The first one is Tyler Dick from the University of Illinois. And you can read the bios of the speakers, so I'm not going to take a lot of time to go over those. Our second speaker will be Pete Swan from Penn State Harrisburg. And our third speaker will then follow up, and that's going to be Dan Sabin from the Iowa Northern Railroad. So we have a reason for the order, and I think that'll be apparent to you as you listen to the speakers. So without further ado, Tyler, I'm going to turn the controls over to you, and I'll let you know if you get close to the, or you run over the time. As Posse said here, yeah, please do use the Q&A to send any questions you have. We'll have time after the speakers finish to go back and take some questions.
All right, well, thanks, Dave. So thanks for joining us this morning for this session on precision scheduled railroading. My presentation here will just briefly summarize some operational aspects of precision scheduled railroading, and then the other speakers in the session will sort of build upon this foundation and get to more of the specifics of the short line implications, which are the main focus of this session. So just as you're probably familiar with, precision scheduled railroading was developed by the late Hunter Harrison during 10 years of multiple Class 1 railroads. And precision scheduled railroading is this very broad railway management and operating philosophy that encompasses all these different pillars related to all sort of elements of the railroad enterprise. And this presentation is really focusing to looking at what are the core operating strategies, basic changes to the train plan, local service, and how that affects the role of yards and terminals that we see changing with different railroads that are implementing or interacting with railroads that are implementing different elements of precision scheduled railroading. So it goes down to the operating strategy, and historically there's sort of two opposing operating strategies that railroads have implemented. And at one end of the spectrum, we had what we call sort of a hold for tonnage type operating philosophy, basically focused on maximizing the length and size and weight of trains and lowering costs, deferring all that or distributing all the cost of a fixed cost of a crew over a larger train to minimize the cost. To build these long trains, we had to focus on potentially delaying or annulling a trains to hold for volume in different terminals. And that created longer transit times and more demand for rolling stock to move a given amount of freight. But because we had these long trains, we could do it in a very low-cost operation. The sort of other end of this perspective has been termed a variety of different things, and one of them is schedule adherence. There's a focus on having short, fast, frequent trains, depart the trains on time, focus on having shorter transit times. And when you do that, you need less rolling stock and fewer locomotives and fewer crews to move a given amount of freight. And that's going to lower your costs that way. So there's sort of these two historical operating strategies. They both have their pluses and minuses. And sort of the unique features of precision scheduled railroading is it tries to meld the best aspects of both strategies. Consistent, frequent service to reduce dwell and transit time, but at the same time, operating long trains that reduce our rolling stock requirements and minimize costs. And the question is, well, how do you do these two sort of very opposite type things? And, how do we make more frequent but longer trains for a given amount of traffic? And one answer to that is operating what we call general purpose trains instead of dedicated trains. That's sort of another change in operating philosophy. So if we look sort of historically, railroads have sort of had independent business lines for different types of traffic. So for example here, a railroad may have intermodal traffic that they operate in a dedicated train. So if we look at this plot here, looking at a 24-hour day, we have arrivals of containers and trailers or intermodal rail cars to a particular terminal, and we have inventory building up during the day. And in this case, at midnight, we wind up departing a 150-car intermodal train. And at the same time, we may have other people designing a train plan for other business lines. So for example, we may have a bulk terminal operation, maybe collecting grain cars. We collect them through the course of the day, and at a different time during the day, we depart a 150-car grain train. And similarly, we might have a different business line that's focused on the manifest or carload traffic, and we build up that traffic independently during the course of the day and operate a 150-car train dedicated to that manifest or carload traffic. So you can see here we've got a lot of cars spending a lot of time in this terminal, and 3 times a day we're departing a 150-car train that's dedicated to a particular type of traffic. So precision scheduled railroading takes a look at this and sort of reorganizes how we use those 3 train departures during a given day and says, we're not going to dedicate those to any one particular type of traffic. Instead, each one of those train departures is going to be a mixed departure or a general purpose train. So let's take a look at what that does to this sort of diagram of our rail car inventory during the course of the day. So as we had before, just before I get to the next slide, looking at this, each type of traffic is dwelling for 24 hours or an average of 12 hours. And the maximum inventory we have in the yard is about 300 rail cars. Under precision scheduled railroading with general purpose trains, what we are doing is instead of having each one of those trains being dedicated to a specific type of traffic, 3 times a day we depart a general purpose train. So we basically have 50 cars of each type accumulate, and then at 8 hours into the day we depart a 150-car general purpose train, 50 cars from each type. We do the same thing 8 hours later, and we do the same thing 8 hours later on that schedule. So the result is that each rail car only really spends a maximum of 8 hours and an average of 4 hours in each terminal, and our inventory, the amount of rail cars we have dwelling in the yard, is also reduced down to 150 rail cars. So both of those have great positive benefits in terms of your service and your transit times across the network, and also reducing the amount of rail cars you need and the amount of sort of storage you need in terminals and the types of things you're doing in that terminal. So that's how general purpose trains fit into this precision scheduled railroading equation. Again, the maximum dwell results in reduced transit time. Another change we have is in local service. We go back to sort of a traditional model. We may have a local yard that serves a number of nearby shippers. We may have 4 locomotives assigned to 2 crews. They go out at the same time, serve those local rail shippers, and it gives great flexibility for timing of service to individual shippers. Using a lot of locomotives and crews working the same shift. Precision scheduled railroading comes in and tries to sort of minimize and make that a very lean operation. Reducing back to 1 locomotive and 1 crew, so a less costly operation. They go and they have to serve all the customers in 1 long shift or 2 back-to-back shifts for 2 crews. Gives a lot less flexibility for timing of service to individual shippers. And there's also a focus on pre-blocking outbound traffic after serving those local shippers, not just hauling all the cars back to the local yard and sending them out, but actually organizing them for better sorting at the main classification yard on the network. So building on that concept of pre-blocking, it really gets down to changing the amount of switching workload we have at our major terminals that connect our different trains and build our trains going to different portions of the network. So what we call switching effort, or the amount of work it takes to sort all the rail cars arriving on an inbound train, can be defined by the quality of sort, and we can improve our quality of sort and reduce the amount of switching effort by additional pre-blocking at our local yards. So just for example here, if we have 1 train that we built at our local yard and we sent this off to our main classification yard, and all of our rail cars indicated here by their their destination by letter or color are all sort of jumbled up or poorly sorted in the train. If we go want to sort those by to their next destination or their block, we have to uncouple that train at a whole bunch of different locations. We have to pull a lot of pins to uncouple that train. That requires a lot of work. So to make those, put those 18 rail cars into the 3 blocks, we've got to do a lot of switching activity. And most likely that's something that's going to be done very efficiently at the hump yard. Instead, if we do a lot of pre-blocking in our local yard, we can wind up with a train that's fairly well sorted. So we've got our 3 blocks here in 4 main groups on our train. To switch those into those blocks, we've really only got to do a couple things. Just basically separate those 2 blocks of cars that are already coupled together and then bring the group block A cars here together. So something that requires a lot less work to create those 3 blocks, something you can probably do fairly easily in a flat yard. Doesn't really require a hump yard to do that type of switching. So pre-blocking can help your network. If we look at this sort of a network perspective, the sort of hump-centric blocking plan that was traditional, we had a major classification yard in the middle of our network that was doing a lot of our sorting work. Our local yards are basically just gathering the rail cars from shippers, putting them together into a train, sending them to the classification yard, and having all the classification yard doing all the work of sorting those rail cars by destination, building outbound manifest trains. So it's a lot of switching work being done in the classification yard, concentrating all that work so it can justify potentially a hump yard at that location. With the changes to the local yard operation and focus on pre-blocking, we have a different sort of scheme occurring on our network. We push all that switching down that was occurring in our classification yard, push it down to all of our local yards to pre-block those trains. So all of our trains leave our local yards, all nicely sorted by block. So when they arrive at the classification yard, there's a lot less switching work to do. We just uncouple those blocks, couple them together, form our outbound manifest trains, and there's a lot less switching activity to take place at the classification yard. The trade-off is, of course, we've got more switching work at all these local yards. So we're better utilizing some of those distributed switching resources we have around the network. So the question is, once we decrease the amount of switching at that main classification yard, can we convert it to a flat yard? And just to sort of illustrate this flow graphically, within the classification yard, this is a diagram here on the left showing our inbound trains and all these little colored lines here are rail cars connecting to the blocks we're forming in the yard, and then the blocks themselves being pulled down and connected to our outbound trains that we're forming in our terminal. So you can see over on the left-hand side, all these complex train-to-block connections, all those little threads of rail cars running all over the place. That's something that a hump yard is really efficient at doing. We take that same amount of traffic, and because of pre-blocking and changes to our operating plan, we simplify the traffic. We have fewer inbound trains, we make fewer blocks, and you can notice here we've got directional traffic where we've only got a subset of trains connecting to the blocks we're making in the network. We can have a much less complex traffic flow and potentially something we can handle very efficiently with a flat yard. So just looking at that from economically, if we look at a flat yard, very low operating cost initially, but a high cost for every car we switch through it. A hump yard, we've got a much higher, basic operating cost, but less cost per rail car. So at a certain volume, our hump yard becomes more efficient than a flat yard. So if you take some of the switching workload away from your hump yard, it becomes more economical to operate that as a flat yard type facility. So there's a minimum volume for a hump yard, given the number of blocks and trains, the use of pre-blocking, and the pattern of train-to-train connections. So that's why some of the decisions you see under precision scheduled railroading that have been made to either close a hump yard or change them to a flat yard. And it's also a lot of the uncertainty because a lot of these parameters are sort of unknown. There's not really a lot of knowledge out there in terms of particulars of yard capacity. So you see some yards that have been converted to a flat yard, switched back to a hump yard, or hump yards have been closed and reopened during the implementation of precision scheduled railroading at various railroads. So just quickly in summary, this is trying to maximize train size. We've got a bunch of different elements, general purpose trains, restructuring our local services, and pre-blocking. And I think it's that no precision scheduled railroad implements all these elements, and PSR is not one thing, but a collection of actions that cumulatively result in significant change in operating practices and culture. So with that, we'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. That was an excellent presentation. It set the stage for Pete to come in and talk about this from a different perspective. So Pete, I'm going to let you go ahead and take control.
Okay. So Tyler just made a great presentation. I've been lucky to see various versions of that, and I think that's the best one yet. It does a really good job of explaining a lot of the details. So I'm Pete Swan. I'm at Penn State Harrisburg. I was in the rail industry for about 10 years and then went into operations management, supply chain management. And so I think what I have to add to the conversation is kind of looking at what's going on with PSR from an operations management, even a point of view or something, out of theory. I'll take a little bit of talk about what I found about actual implementation from talking to people in the field and give a little bit of my explanation or thoughts about the future. So a couple of things to understand about railroad operations is first off, it's a service industry. It has variable amounts of traffic, and the amount of traffic it has is what's called dependent demand. The demand for rail traffic is dependent on the demand for the goods being traveled, and that's why you see a big dip in rail traffic during COVID. Additionally, railroads can't store their product, so they have to make use of their assets immediately, or they're kind of wasted assets. Batch production also dominates in the rail industry. You have when processing a train at a hump yard, you have to do it one car at a time, and so that makes it difficult to make special switches. It makes it difficult to yard a train because you have to do one car to get it the next. Both of these limit efficiency. And if you look at the history of rail operations to some extent previously, one of the things they focused on was getting more traffic through bottlenecks. How do we run more with what we have? Previously, Tyler did a good thing about saying the two previous views of operating railroads. And from an economic point of view, I would also add that most railroads tried to maximize profit for the set of assets that they had. How can we generate the most profit from what we have? Under PSR, that's changed dramatically. The new goal is maximizing return on investment. Okay, we'd like to reduce assets because that reduces investment, and then any profit we make, it's a better return on investment. And we'd also like to maximize the profitability of and productivity of the remaining assets. And Tyler went over a lot of how that gets done. Now, theoretically, when we look at operations management, one of the theories that used to apply to railroad operations significantly was theory of constraints, focusing on bottlenecks to increase throughput. But with PSR, we're starting to basically apply lean manufacturing techniques or a philosophy of waste reduction. When railroads look at their set of assets, a number of them are historically not used very well. We have more locomotives than we might need. If we run two crews during the day for local, and we switch it to one in the day and one at the night, we've halved the number of locomotives. That was kind of waste. And we'd like to create some sort of level loading. When I think of lean manufacturing, I think of assembly lines, repetitive manufacturing, and the railroads would like to get to that because it's very, very efficient. It really can maximize your return on assets. Problem is, we go back to this dependent demand and the stochastic nature that we get traffic when we get it. It makes it very difficult to be that repetitive. And finally, railroads have started to apply the kind of basic Six Sigma thinking. And Six Sigma, many people think is quality, but as it's applied at GE and other firms, it's a program for profit maximization. It attempts to improve or increase the distance between the revenue received for a service and the cost to provide it. And that maximizes your profit. So that's kind of where the railroads are coming at for this. So looking at what's happened under PSR, there's been a lot of good. The reduced reliance on costly hump yards, I think, has been a big plus for the industry. It's still kind of shaking out, but there's a tremendous fixed cost of running a hump yard. And, I was looking at some, YouTube of cars going over Bailey Yard at North Platte. And if you watch it, you'll see that, 4 cars will go over in a row and they'll all go on the same track. Well, it would be a lot faster if you used a flat yard and switched them all in one cut. And the railroads are starting to find that out. The efforts to run fewer balanced general purpose trains versus specialized trains dramatically improves service, and it also dramatically improves asset utilization, as Tyler's already gone over. And so one of the things when you start looking at the results from a shipper point of view is for many trips, the average transit time's down slightly and the variability is down significantly. Okay, there's a lot of customers in the rail industry who are much better off under PSR than before. And you look at the industry itself, the operating ratio is down near 60%. And I would suggest also that the skills they've learned in redoing ops under PSR has helped them respond to the changes in traffic under COVID-19. So that's the good. There's a bad side to this too. Not all rail trips have been improved by PSR. There's been a significant number of routings that take longer and have had increased variability. There's more circuitous routing. Because the yards have been closed in many cases, you have to go west, block a car before it can go east. And the worst effects appear to be at the start of a trip and the end of the trip, first and last mile, and also for lower volume customers. The unit train story in Hunter's book about taking a unit train once a week and converting it to cuts of 20 merchandise cars and how that reduced the amount of cars they needed and everything is a great story. But there's another side to that as well. I've talked to shippers who shipped a unit train of aggregates, and when they went to blocks of cars, they had to increase their car supply by 25% because it took longer. They were hurt by that. And primarily low density locations seem to be the places that are hurt most by PSR. If you're trying to maximize the return on assets, you basically don't want to put extra trains in where they're needed some of the time or extra locomotives. And so a place out in the middle of a short line that has, or excuse me, a light density line that doesn't have much traffic is going to have less trains running to it. The locals will all run whenever. As an example, there's one short line that used to get a 50-car interchange 3 days a week. And under PSR, that changed to 150-car interchange once a week. But then there was another short line interchanged at a yard that had a lot of traffic, and they were in and out like clockwork 5 times a week. So it depends where you are as to how much you benefited from PSR. The changes to the demurrage and accessorial tariffs have basically been an effort to take costs that used to accrue to the railroads because of variability and force them onto the shippers. And I could go longer with that, but I have limited amount of time. I will say that the other side of PSR that I think is somewhat threatening is the loss of manpower. If you look at CSX, management is down 40% between 2014 and 2019. T&E crews are down 24% at CSX, and this is down 11% versus the industry. And there's similar cuts to MOE and MOW. Now, I've heard stories about it being nearly impossible to get new rates because there isn't the person at that desk moved from somewhere else. They don't have the authority to give you a rate even if they've had it. So one of the things that's resulted in this is traffic being diverted off the railroads onto the highways. And people talk about the turning to growth, the pivot to growth. It's not clear that that's going to happen because it's difficult to secure new business. There are fewer marketing sales employees, concentration of authority. And I will skip the rest of this. So philosophical conflict, lean, view of railroad operations management versus a service business. Normally in a service business, you try to provide some service the customer wants. Under PSR, the railroads provide a service and the customers can take it or leave it to a large extent. In how successful are the railroads going to be to changing from a variable dependent demand to a less variable, more elastic demand based on their charges? The Canadian railroads have had a lot of growth under PSR more recently. but it's not clear that that's going to apply the same way here in the US with a much more complex network and them being really hobbled from the initial implementations, manpower-wise. So the railroads are often said to have a common carrier responsibility, but they also have a fiduciary responsibility. All of the savings that have come out of the rail industry have been huge, but they have all gone to shareholders. Rates continue to go up. And, you know, so where does this fiduciary responsibility end, and where does the responsibility to stakeholders begin? So in summing it up, PSR has been very good for the rail industry. Some shippers have benefited mightily, but you know, long term, I think it's bad for traffic because the goal is to maximize return on investment, not profit, and it's not to provide needed service as a common carrier, but to maximize profit again. So I'm out of time. I want to thank everybody, and I'll be ready to answer questions after we're all done.
And we do have some questions already, so that's great, Pete. Thank you for that. It was an excellent presentation. And now we're going to queue up Dan Sabin, our Shortline representative, who is in the trenches, as it were. So, Dan, are you there?
I am. Do you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for inviting me to join this. It's quite interesting. Are you going to put my slides up?
Yes, I'm just working with Posse to get that done now.
Okay, hold on a second. I'll be right with you.
Sorry about that.
I can go ahead and begin while you're doing that.
Go ahead, please do.
Okay.
I don't want to take any of your time.
I think Tyler and Pete did a really good job really laying out the theories and the complexities of what PSR has done. As a short line, we're very fortunate that we have connections with Union Pacific, Canadian Pacific, as well as Canadian National, and we access the Iowa Interstate Railway through the Crandic Railroad in Cedar Rapids. We've always had a bit of a leverage opportunity with our customers being able to have numerous types of routings for their traffic just because of our positioning in the network. With PSR, things change very quickly, and one of the most difficult things that we recognized very quickly was if Hunter was there was a bloodbath of experience, and we found that a tremendous amount of the institutional knowledge of how to run the railroad was either dismissed or somehow eliminated by the company. And as a consequence, we found that if the line did not have a Hunter organization running it, we were able to establish a much stronger operating base with people that were working. I'll give you an example. Canadian National, of course, was the first one under the PSR, and CN got to be very difficult to work with. They were changing people constantly. We really had a rough time dealing with them. They didn't take the short lines too seriously. CP was the next one, and they had literally eliminated all of the people in the ground that we had worked with. We had an assistant superintendent that we worked with for about 15 years. He was summarily dismissed. They changed.
Dan, just quickly, let me know when you want to move. I finally got the slides. Sorry, I had a little bit of difficulty getting them up. Let me know what slide you want me to go.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead to the UP slide, that's fine. That one right there is fine.
Okay, great.
So what we found was the assistant superintendent that had a great deal of institutional knowledge had gone on to another railway, and there was a revolving door of a number of operating people that we worked with, none of which had any railroad experience. In fact, I called one day, talked to the assistant superintendent, and I said, where were you assigned before? And he said, well, I ran a Bed Bath & Beyond store. and I have no railroad experience whatsoever. So getting back to a little more detail about the three railroads we work with, UP is by far the best. They kept the experienced people where they knew what the operation needed. They were very good to work with, but the real change came from headquarters. Uh, they eliminated a lot of the bureaucracy. They became very focused on our role as the first mile, last mile service. They started a really good level of communication. They assigned a person that was our liaison that could literally get through any department within a day. They adopted a lot of their operations to fit what our customer needed, and they showed an incredible amount of appreciation for what we are doing with them. They're making changes quickly to identify and rectify the service issues. And to give you an example, we had a way freight that works 3 days a week on our line, and we started intermodal service from the LA Basin. We were getting the inbound traffic 3 days a week, but the outbound traffic had to be there the day ahead. And so we were never able to run a turn with the train with one crew. It was costing us a lot of money. We talked to UP about it. They're now swapping the base locations of the way freight so that we'll be getting the inbound and outbound traffic on literally at the same time. The other thing they've done is they've turned over a lot of their industrial switching to us. And give you an example there, we had a large implement company that was served by UP and the predecessor C&W to get a load of export machinery to the Port of Baltimore with UP and Norfolk Southern. They were taking 21 days. We took over, we set up an 8-hour schedule to make interchange with the UP at Cedar Rapids. We have that down to 7 days of transit time now, and the customer has increased the volume of rail traffic now by almost 8 times, and has almost eliminated all of the truck moves that were associated with that in the past. We've been very encouraged by UP with industrial development along our line. We've had by the end of 2021, there will be $2 billion worth of new investment in a 10-year period on our line. UP's been very encouraging. If a customer comes to them in that area, said, I'd like to put up a plant or something, they'll say, we'll start with the Iowa Northern, go with them, and we'll work very carefully to make sure that it's all taken care of. And they've really lived up to that. They also called up and said, you've had all these crazy ideas for the last 20 years, send them all back in. Let's start looking through some of the ideas you've had, and let's make something really grow. The consequence of this relationship with UP has meant that in a 3-year period, Iowa Northern will increase the volume and the revenue by about 120% from where we were prior to the UP. Next slide, please. CP and CN are the other ones, and there, as I mentioned, there's tremendous difficulty in working with them. CP probably has one of the best senior marketing teams that I've seen in my career. They're good people. They're very responsive. They had all of us come into Calgary and said, we got to really clean up our act. We want to recognize that 35% of our business is coming from the short lines. Tell us what we need to do. But the difficulty with CP is there was never a connection to this new attitude with the field. The field is still dealing with tremendously inexperienced people who are told to do something, and if it doesn't come from Minneapolis or Calgary, they won't make any changes. There's no flexibility. They can't seem to get any interchanges correct. They run traffic by our interchange. Generally speaking, it's pretty lousy operation. Of course, now we're on the end of their grain lines, so it's probably a bit better along their main lines, but it makes it very difficult for us to function with them. And most of our customers refuse to route anything over CP. we do a tremendous volume of oats at Cedar Rapids and a lot of chemicals with CP. And they're very good at just dumping traffic on us far beyond the capacity of the interchange. In the DM&E days, we had built an additional interchange track that held 80 cars, but it was a mile away from their main track, and now they're just refusing to use it because it ties up their crew for an hour or so to make the interchange. So a lot of it gets run by and congests their yard in Mason City. CN is quite a bit different. What's happened recently with CN is a little troubling. They had a really strong team in Chicago that worked with us, had a senior marketing rep that was very tied to the hip with the general manager, and we could pretty much get anything done that we needed to. And they got an exceptional volume of our outbound traffic, which is primarily ethanol. Now they've really gone to a system-centric approach. Everything is oriented toward headquarters in Montreal, and they don't really seem to realize that a collection of small traffic gains from the Shortline partners can provide a large benefit to the system performance. Generally, CN has become, they continue cooperating, but they're very condescending to, at least to the Iowa Northern, and very difficult to work with.
About a minute, Dan.
Okay, that concludes my presentation. I guess we're going to be ready for questions now.
Yes, we are, and we do have some questions from our audience. Let me just go down through those, and I'll read the question out. Are y'all able to see the questions, the presenters? I don't know if you can or not, so let me just read the first one. And I'm not going to necessarily take these in the order that they are listed here. First one is a question for Pete. Do you think that the negative elements of PSR are intrinsic to the theory, or are they problems with the way the railroads either interpret or execute PSR?
Well, I think they're not intrinsic to PSR. I think PSR as an operating system can work very, very well. But I think the problem stems from the impetus to introduce and implement PSR has come from the financial community, whose interest is also to basically squeeze more money out of the railroads. Now, you know, if you look back to what happened with CN a few years back when they ran out of capacity on the western side of Canada, that's basically what can happen if you run the railroad to make it like a cash cow instead of run it for the long term. And so I don't think that's PSR necessarily. I think that's basically because of the way publicly owned companies operate in a quarter-to-quarter environment.
Okay. Next question. The rail industry seems to be going in the opposite direction of the long-term needs of the country. Efficient transportation is a key resource for economic activity, and highway freight operations are higher cost, increasing congestion and damaging infrastructure. How can the rail share of freight traffic be substantially increased over a period of years? There's probably a lot to that question, but I guess in the context of PSR, what are the panel's thoughts? And any of you can speak up.
Well, I'll jump in real quick. I think certainly the improved operations, improved transit time, better car utilization, better local utilization, better crew utilization, better asset utilization are going to lower the cost and certainly provide the opportunity to capture more traffic from competing modes or competing businesses. However, if you're using the railroad to collect rent, if you will, profits in excess of economic cost, you're going to leave some traffic on the table. And so the only way to try and enforce that is through some rate regulation that's effective out of the Surface Transportation Board. But I personally don't see that anytime in the near future.
Other comments? Here's one. With local yards doing the blocking, when the train is put together, is there any consideration to the train makeup? In other words, trailing tonnage, conventional TOFC flats on rear end versus 5-packs on head end, et cetera, the types of things that typically are found in timetable and special instructions.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Obviously, you know, some of the little cartoon diagrams I showed show an ideal situation where, you know, you don't have to worry about all those train makeup considerations. But that's one of the things that, you know, separates the theory of pre-blocking from the actual implementation is you do have all these train makeup rules on you know, placement of cars and hazmat and short long car combinations and distributing the tonnage throughout the train. So that is where some of the theory departs, and ideally you can't get a train perfectly pre-blocked, and so you do have some amount of work you're always going to have to do. That's also a concern in hump yards as well, where, you know, just building a normal block or assembling blocks in hump yards where you randomly just don't get the cars coming over the hump in the correct order, and you do have to take care of those train makeup restrictions during the pull down and train assembly process. So either way you go, whether it's pre-blocked or you're sending everything to a major classification yard, whether it's flat switching or a hump yard, you still got to respect all those train makeup restrictions. It does, of course, get even more challenging when you start dealing with, you know, 150, 200 car train sizes like are being built, you know, more recently under these types of operations where you've got a lot more considerations within the same train.
Tyler, I'll just add one thing. I don't think it's all that different from the way it used to be. When I was at CSX, 40 years ago, we used to run some really badly put together trains that occasionally caused derailments. Under PSR, you've seen a couple string line derailments in Fostoria, 2 at Horseshoe Curve, 1 in Harrisburg, 1 in Baltimore. And what's happened is after they get a string line derailment, management basically changes it so you don't get one a second time or at least a third. And that kind of what happened when I was doing operations. People screwed up and said, no, just do it. Train would derail, and then we quit doing it.
Here's another one. If the growth for rail industry is dependent on manifest trains, more typically seen from local sources, isn't Pete's point critical? Will shippers go back to rail if service is even less frequent? Any thoughts on that?
Well, to some extent it's happened. I talked to a number of shippers that at some of their locations that weren't shipping that much quit shipping rail altogether. Shippers that provide marginal profits for the railroad, I think one of these is maybe some of the paper companies, are in danger of kind of losing service or it eventually not being economical. So I think that's certainly the case, but there is hope. I mean, if you look at what CP's at least been saying, which is kind of counter to what Dan said, they're very cognizant of the need to work with short lines and grow merchandise traffic because you know, the grain traffic will do what it does, the potash will do what it does, but the only really new sources of traffic are maybe some intermodal lanes and merchandise. So I think if you eventually have to provide some more revenue, people start looking there.
This is Dan. I'd like to add to what Pete just said. One of the interesting coincidences, perhaps, is with COVID, we've found that the culture of our customers has changed dramatically. We provided 7-day-a-week service, had pretty much a 24-hour, 7-day operation. As the traffic diminished with the COVID crisis, the customers seem to be a lot more willing to understand that we needed to probably tie some of the needs of the customers together and maybe not make a 7-day-a-week delivery, but rather a 5 or in some cases a 3-day-a-week to some of the interchanges. What we've really found now is that there's a cultural change with the customers as a consequence that's forced us all to talk a lot more. We have a lot more communication and a lot better understanding of each other's issues. So I think that does help overall for the industry, at least in the single carload business.
Very good. Thanks, Dan. I think we've probably got time for one or two more questions. Here's one. See if you want to tackle this one. Why were Hunter Harrison shippers in the Wisconsin Central Territory, that's, you know, the old Wisconsin Central that CN took over, so dissatisfied with their experiences with PSR? And you could probably relate that to other other railroads that Hunter entered into. I know CSX, there were probably a lot of customers that were not real happy initially either. Has PSR changed or improved since that era? Any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question. You know, the particular example that was posed here regarding, you know, former Wisconsin Central, I mean, you can imagine the customers in that area went from sort of one extreme to another, where they had a fairly sizable, you know, regional railroad that delivered, you know, short line style customized service, where very quickly they went to, you know, PSR, very regular, very predictable, but doesn't fit the plan, you know, very inflexible type service. So I could see where that was a very potentially difficult change for the customers involved, going from sort of one extreme to the other in terms of you know, the sort of values behind the service and how the operation was run. But without knowing the details, I'm, you know, would be purely sort of speculating on the exact nature of that.
I could add that one of the issues we saw was the pricing strategy of a short line or a regional would sit down with the customer and find the sweet spot on where they needed to be in pricing to be able to get particularly local business like logs and the pulpwood side. Once CN took over, it was a real easy way to get rid of that nuisance traffic by just raising all the rates.
Yeah, we're about out of time here, so I'll just add one comment. You know, if you've read Hunter's little red book, I guess there's actually two books, but the first one is the more easily obtained. You know, he lays out his theory of PSR, which is all well and good, and he makes a lot of, you know, points that I think hardly anybody would disagree with who's in the industry. But the way that he actually implemented that did not necessarily follow what was in the book. And I think that's where the rub is with many customers, because Hunter certainly doesn't preach in the book what CN did to the former Wisconsin Central, or a lot of them in that takeover. So
I think that extends to safety as well. You read what's in the book and see what happens in at least initial operations, and it's completely different.
Yes, yes. So the theory is one thing, the implementation is not necessarily the same as what the theory dictates. And I think we see those little variations among the class ones, and that's why perhaps the UP, as Dan pointed out, is doing a stellar job of working with his railroad, whereas the other two railroads, which both have been taken through the PSR metamorphosis by Hunter personally, it's different. So with that, we're at 10:51, and I think our tech people are going to give us the hook here in a minute. We're supposed to finish up by 10:50. So I'd like for everybody to give a round of virtual thanks to our three excellent presenters. And with that, we'll go ahead and get ready for the next session.
Great, thanks, Dave. I'm just going to jump in for a second. So we're going to close this session, and as soon as we're going to start opening the next sessions, we have our breakouts 2A and 2B. So breakout 2A is going to be about crate crossing safety, developments in crate crossing and trespasser safety. And on the breakout 2B is going to be talking about the LNG transportation by rail. So two other interesting sessions. So take your little break, restroom break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Posse. Thank you, Pete, Tyler, and Dan. I really appreciate the excellent effort. I think we've given the audience a very good perspective on certainly what is the central focus of the Class 1 railroad industry right now, or at least it seems to be, except for perhaps BNSF. And I think even they're influenced by this as well. So thanks again, and that's it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.